I tend to wander while I talk, so I thought I'd use the mic. I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me, and then for Scott Dowd, who's actually the director of Project Piaba, which I'll talk about, for suggesting or suggesting that I come and chat about the program. As you gather, I'm not going to be talking about dogs, but I did want to at least put some mammals up. So this is me a long time ago when I was in high school. And this is actually what got me into aquatic medicine. I had the opportunity to bottle raise 2 walrus pups. And that sort of got me on the track. And I actually didn't get to fish till later. I went from walruses to beluga whales to being a grizzly bear and black bear keeper, and then a bunch of other things. Eventually I found fish, and that was when I got into veterinary school. So, but I want you to know that I don't just work with fish. I used to work with a lot of other species. So there's the title you have, and Scott knows I do this. He'll give me a title and then I change it. So I'm going to talk about Project Piaba, but then what I'm going to talk about is kind of what I know. And my work is sort of a veterinarian, and I'm an extension veterinarian. So I work for the Extension Service. I wear a lot of hats. I'm an extension veterinarian. I'm also a lab animal veterinarian, but strictly work with aquatic lab animals. So I'm going to talk about kind of my perspective of how we developed an extension program as part of this project. So there's a lot of partners. I work, obviously I work with Project Piaba, but I also work with the Aquarium Science Program, which if anyone's interested, I'm happy to answer questions about that later. It's a professional program to train aquatic husbandry professionals. But let's talk about what I do. So I work on a project called Project Piaba. The logo is Buy a Fish, Save a Tree. And we work in Brazil. And right where that arrow is the city of Manaus. And well, actually where the arrow is the Rio Negro, which is this river right here. And Manaus is a city where the Rio Negro and the Amazon join together. Actually, above that confluence, it's actually called the Solimões, and below that, it's the Amazon proper. So we work on the Rio Negro, which is one of the largest tributary of the Amazon. And we work upriver about 400 miles from Manaus in this area that's circled right here. And we're working with an aquarium fishery that is a sustainable fishery. And there are about 700 species that actually can be collected there, that actually have potential marketability within the trade. One of the other things that's kind of interesting is if you look at this archipelago here, this is actually the largest freshwater archipelago in the world. It's pretty interesting. It's really interesting to navigate, especially at low water. So the Rio Negro is a classic black water river. So it's also the largest tributary of the Amazon. I mentioned that already. And the basin drains 750,000 square kilometers. It's a huge area that it drains. What's really interesting about it is that the water is fed from ancient mountain ranges called the Guiana Shield. And it's really interesting because it's low, has very low pH. The lowest pH we've ever measured on this project is 2.38 in a tributary, and it was teeming with fish. Okay, if you have a cut on your hand, you notice it when you put your hand in the water. It's low in nutrients, low in dissolved solids and conductivity, but there's tremendous biodiversity. In fact, it's one of the fish biodiversity hotspots on the planet. And but the fish don't get very big because the nutrient levels are so low. But they make up, the fish that are there are just, they don't get very big. They're wonderful for keeping in home aquariums. The most famous is probably the cardinal tetra. And in the mid-90s, it represented more than 80% of the ornamental fish exports out of Barcelos, which is a city I'll tell you about. It's in the middle of the jungle, and made up for 60% of the local income. So pretty big amount, pretty important fishery. They have the fish have an annual reproduction cycle, very short lifespans in nature, but really high recruitment. And they tend to collect these fish when the water is dropping and they get isolated in these pools. The other thing about these fish is they're very sensitive to environmental changes. And so that will affect their population structure. This area of the Amazon is actually pretty pristine. In fact, it's only been recently that we've had to deal with forest fires there. And that's not because of fires to burn to make room for plantations. It's because of climate change and decreasing humidity in the jungles. So that's been an issue, but these fish are very sensitive, and the communities actually they may not understand the specifics of that sensitivity, but they understand that the areas where each village has control of, that they have to control access there for fishing. So each community has sort of their own fishing grounds, and they don't really tolerate other people going in and fishing there. So Project Piaba was actually started in the 80s by Dr. Labish Chow. And he was a professor at the University of Amazonas. And he started this project not as a sustainable development project or anything like that. It was actually to take his students out in the field and teach them field biology. Well, these fish were relatively easy to collect, and you could get them on your vessel and you could work with them and set up little short experiments and things like that. But as he worked with them more, he realized these villages, this was a big part of their economy. And he became more and more interested in, well, how can we preserve this fishery, showing that it was sustainable, doing that work. When he retired, Scott Dowd, some of you may have heard him speak before. I spoke last year, a couple of years ago at this meeting. This is Scott Dowd. He took over the project and really started to shift it away from the training of the field biologists. Some of that is coming back, and I'll talk about that at the end, and really focusing on exposing the customers and the import end of the industry to this fishery, and then also working with the fishers to improve sort of the quality of the exports and the packing and the collection, that kind of thing. And that's kind of where I came in, but we'll go a little bit further. So, excuse me. So it's a community-based interdisciplinary project. We go on these expeditions every year, and there'll be a couple veterinarians on there. There'll be fisheries biologists. There'll be geneticists. We've had anthropologists and sociologists working on different projects when we're down on the trip. And this is a little plug, if anyone's interested in going, we also take eco-tourists because that helps pay for the project. So if you're interested in spending 2 weeks on the Amazon, particularly if you're from the Northwest, when the weather's kind of bad, we go in January. So, so the project originally was trying to understand the ecological and sociocultural impacts, look at the biodiversity of the fishery, looking at the interrelationships between the different natural resources, and then helping develop a sustainable fishery. So it's really unique. It's very species rich. It's a fragile ecosystem. It's very important to the communities in terms of their just socio and economic health. And the important thing is that everybody throughout the chain of custody, from the fishers at the collection all the way to the retailers and hobbyists, can have a role to play in this at a minimum, and just trying to understand the fishery and understand what these fish go through to get here and how they're collected. So, at the core, we're looking at a sustainable aquarium fishery, and at the same time, trying to preserve the floodplain ecosystem. And the way we do that is by preserving the fishery, because these fishers are out in these areas. And if anybody's trying to move in with logging or mining, they know. And so if the fishers aren't there, nobody's out there. And then the other thing, this is, it's providing a livelihood. And one of their biggest competitors, I'll talk about it briefly later, is fish that have been taken out of Brazil and used as broodstock in other countries, particularly in Asia, to produce these fish. And so a lot of these fishers are now competing with aquaculturists in other countries. And so the overall project is trying to help them compete in that world. But if we're going to do this, and this is where I comes in as a veterinarian, if you're going to have a sustainable fishery, you've got to have quality health management throughout the chain of custody. So, and that's where I got involved, because some of the importers and the exporters and some of the end users, public aquariums and hobbyists, were saying, hey, the fish that are coming out of here aren't as healthy as they used to be, or aren't the quality we'd like to see. And we're having high losses. Now, before there was an aquaculture, a market for these aquacultured species, these fish were valuable enough that the retailers and the importers would bring those fish in, they would stabilize them, spend money stabilizing them, and then sell them because they could get the price they wanted for them. Now they're competing with these aquaculture species and they can't really justify those additional expenses. So we're working at the front end of the chain of custody. So we got involved. Well, so we're dealing with that. We're dealing with competition from farm stocks, and there's this poor consistency. And then they have really, and this isn't my area, but the business practices and the husbandry practices are just sort of all over the place in Brazil. And communication is an issue from the exporters to the fishers, and from the exporters with the importers. There's some real issues there. And that's another area where the Project Piaba have tried to smooth that a bit. And then air freight prices. So in Asia, all of the producers negotiate in mass for their freight prices. These guys negotiate individually. And then with COVID, we had just whole routes just taken off the map. So that's been a big issue for them as well. I got involved to look at the fishery from a health management standpoint, from collection all the way to export. And what Scott asked our group to do is look at capture, handling, and transport, look at nutrition throughout the chain of custody, look at water quality, look at the holding and husbandry, and then identify the issues that have the greatest impact on fish health. And it's kind of a sort of a pseudo HACCP approach, if you're familiar with hazard analysis and critical control point analysis. So we identified those factors, and then what Scott wanted us to do was develop strategies to mitigate those factors. Turns out a lot of them are pretty straightforward and isn't really rocket science. And then develop a training program, excuse me, to train trainers in Brazil to work with the fishers and work with the importers and work with the transit stations. So that was our overall goal. And then of course, with any extension program, and this is a standard extension approach for international extension, go back and evaluate the outcomes. Did we do what we hoped we would do? So that was sort of the goal. First thing was characterize the chain of custody, and it's really complex. So everywhere you see an orange line here, there's fish being transported. Okay, there's a lot of transport going on. They're in a box. If I did this, I did some work with the fisheries in Indonesia and in Malaysia, and everywhere you saw an arrow, there's fish on a boat or in a truck or in an airplane. There they could be on a bicycle, they could be on a camel, they could be on, it was just amazing. But anyway, everywhere you see these, we've got fish being moved. And so they're captured out in the jungle, they're moved to fishing camps or villages, and then they move to transit stations. A lot of people thought, well, they just go directly to the exporters in Manaus. Well, they don't. They go to transit stations. And when we originally started this project, we thought that they only went to transit stations in Barcelos, which is a large city, about 10,000 people. It's in the middle of the jungle. The only way you can get there is by boat or airplane. Turns out we found out there's two more farther north. So we had a couple expeditions where we went, instead of 400 miles upriver, we went about 600 miles upriver. And we found turned out that there were these two other places that were actually moving a fair amount of fish. They were gathering fish from the fishers and then shipping them downriver. So then they go downriver, they go in a transport vessels, and I'll show you what these things are like. They're just a standard riverboat to the exporters in Manaus, where they're shipped via the air. Originally, when we started working on the project, most of the fish that came out of Manaus went through Florida before they went to Europe and Asia. Now they move to both places, and then they go through the typical chain of custody here. So it's a pretty complex chain of custody. So this is an example of one of the villages where they collect fish. This is Deraquá. And the reason all the houses are on stilts is because the water level fluctuates here dramatically between the dry season and the wet season. If you come here in the wet season, the water's right up to the edges of the bottoms of the houses. So the fish are collected in a couple of different ways. They'll collect them just using a boat paddle. and a net called a happoche, and they'll just herd the fish into the net and then get them in the net, scoop them out with a plastic bowl or a gourd, and they'll put them in a basket that's lined with plastic. Or they'll use a trap called a kukuri, where they'll bait it and the fish will come in and they'll dip them out the same way. Pretty low impact. The way they collect some of the catfish, plecos and things like that, little more labor intensive. And that's actually where we have a little more work to do. And we've been working really hard to reduce some of there's some trauma that can occur to the fish when they're getting them out of these logs that they're hiding in. The other thing, then they'll bring them back to the village. They'll sort them. So they get put in these totes. We call them casapas, or they call them casapas. And they're sorted by species and size, and then they're put in these floating pens. And they're held there until enough are gathered to ship them downstream to Barcelos, to the transit stations. So they're typically shipped in these small boats like this on these casapas, and they go to these transit stations. And here's just some pictures of them. They can be pretty elaborate like this. Floating building when they're held in, the casapas are all stacked here, and then the water's changed manually regularly, and they're fed. Or they can be an old barge they've just pulled up and stacked the fish there, or they can be just stacked up on the shore. This is something we're moving them slowly away from because the water temperatures fluctuate dramatically here. This is the school bus on this part of the Amazon, in case you're interested. This was an interesting place. I was the one that showed them that they needed a new floor when I fell through the floor into the river. That was interesting. So it seems that every country I go to, I break something like that. So this is the transport vessel. So the animals are taken down to Barcelos or to one of those other San Gabriel or Santa Isabella on this vessel. Then they're transferred onto these are the standard cargo vessels that you see on the Amazon. So cargo's down here, passengers are up top, they sling hammocks, and you just sit in your hammock or lay in your hammock until you get to your destination. They go from here. This shot was taken in Barcelos. From Barcelos to Manaus, which is where all the exporters are, it's 30 hours on the boat. So they're chugging down river. Then they get to the exporters, and these are just some of the exporters. They can be kind of primitive holding systems like this, where they're just ponds dug out with visqueen and palm fronds to cover them, or they can be much more elaborate holding systems or tanks. Excuse me, I'm getting over cold. And then before they're held here, and then the orders are placed by the importers in the US or Europe or Asia. Then they go out. They're inspected by government veterinarians before the shipments go out. And then they're shipped to the US. A couple of things I want to point out here. This is the medicine chest. This is a little scary as a veterinarian. None of them are labeled properly. We don't really know what they are. We can guess. If any of you have been in the fish world for a while, you can guess what these things are. They're effective. They're also carcinogenic, mutagenic, and teratogenic, but that's an issue. The other issue we saw, and I'll talk about this later, is that none of the food was stored properly. So most of the commercial food that they were feeding was rancid. So one of the big areas that we developed in our education program is proper food storage. We're also looking on better diet formulations too. So what did we see after we've looked at all of this? So long supply chain. You can have an animal can be anywhere from 30 to 60 days or longer from the time it's collected to the time it ends up in an importer. Okay. Nutrition was a big issue. Most of the food was outdated. It was rancid because it was stored poorly. In fact, the first couple of trips we went on, we actually had a nutritionist from Mars come with us, and they're actually working on, based on all this, they're working on some diet formulations now. The diet was inappropriate. So these are small fish, and oftentimes when they're feeding commercial aquaculture chow, the pellet size was too large. So you'd see them feeding the fish and the fish wouldn't respond. But all you'd have to do is reach into the pond, just grab a food in your hand like this and put it back in there, and they just all come up and start feeding. So very simple thing to fix. And then we see big water quality shifts. You'd think ammonia would be the biggest issue, but it was pH and dissolved oxygen. So as they're shipping, if they're not changing the water, remember it's really warm there. We're on the equator. As the water temperature increases, dissolved oxygen in the water decreases. So you would see dissolved oxygen being saturated and dropping down to maybe 1.5 parts per million. You like to see it up about 6 or 7 during transport. And then the pH, they're coming out of low pH. And if they're not paying attention, and when they do the water changes, they may be adding higher pH water. And so that can be a shock to them physiologically. But then if you have ammonia in the system, as the pH increases, the ammonia becomes more toxic. So those are things, all things we had to deal with. Some of the other things we noticed, these are things, I list all these, you may look at them and think, oh my gosh, these are not unusual things I have seen traveling over the world and even in the US in terms of fish care. Not really a lot of disease control techniques or biosecurity, mainly because nobody had educated them about it. All in and all out stocking isn't practiced in the holding facilities, where you move one group of animals in, then you move them all out, disinfect and clean, and then move the next batch in. They weren't doing that. So you're getting mixing, which can set up for some more disease issues. Rough mesh nets for fish transfer. These fish have delicate scales and delicate skin, and the mesh nets could abrade them. So we would get fish that we would see there, or even when we get them here, with abrasions on the skin, which sets them up for secondary and tertiary infections. High holding densities. When they're sorting fish, they would throw them into the different totes. So that's not good. Stressful water changes. Basically, you saw those casapas, they take a tote off the top of the pile, put it down here, and then take a bucket of water and just change the water like that. Well, the fish are tumbling. So that's an issue. Easy to fix though. Leaving fish dry. If the boat shifted or the ground shifted, they get stuck. And so that was a little issue. The net pens would clog easily with algae. And so you'd get reduced flow. Lack of shade. When we're in the cities, you get oil on the water surfaces. We saw potential disease vectors moving in and out, amphibians, reptiles moving in and out of the tanks. Incompatible species sometimes were mixed. Basically not practicing all in or all out. And then that's poor nutrition. You look at this and think, oh my gosh, we shouldn't be doing this. This is all fixable. This is all stuff I actually have dealt with hobbyists. I've dealt with retailers. So this is a fixable thing. For the veterinarians there, we would subsample fish at each stage and look at, do a basic clinical exam. The animals were emaciated. The ones in yellow are the most common things we'd see. So we'd see fin erosion. We'd see protozoans on the skin and on the gills. Very manageable. Hemorrhages, and then internally, you'd see gill hyperplasia, mainly due to the water quality issues. And we'd see encysted nematodes and trematodes are coming out of the wild. We expect that. Manageable. Roundworms in the GI. And then, these few other things we would see, but not as common as you'd expect. And bacterial septicemias were actually kind of rare. And usually it happened after they had been in a holding facility for a while. So they weren't coming in that way, which goes along with some work we've done with marine imports, where they don't come in with bacterial infections. They develop bacterial infections while they're in the holding facilities. Just some of the common things that we would see on these animals. Most all of them are manageable. So what do we do? Well, first thing, we developed a best handling practices manual. Now, the literacy level in this area is kind of low. So while the manual has text, it's in Portuguese, we really focused on cartoons that illustrated the main points. And our trainers would actually use these cartoons in their presentations, either if they were lucky enough to have power, use it in a PowerPoint presentation, or just flip charts. But, just to give an example, this is illustrating don't overcrowd. And then this one here is don't overcrowd and don't overfeed. Here, temperature fluctuation sets them up for disease. Those are the concepts we're trying to develop. Don't use your fish holding for holding other stuff. And then let's make sure there's enough water in there for the fish to actually move around. So the Train the Trainer program that we developed, the idea was to identify and train local biologists and fisheries professionals to be a resource. Locals, many of them were from the area. You know, if you're doing a program like this in another country, the last thing you want is a guy like me sitting up there and tell you how to do it. So my job was to train them, and we had a whole team that did this. Now they're already trained in basic aquaculture, fisheries biology, or in those particular fields. So it's sort of a refresher and reminding them about health management and maybe building on that. So the idea is then they would be the ones that would work with the fishers and the exporters and the transit stations. They would also be the conduit for information. Hey, we're seeing problems with these shipments. You feed it back to our trainers, they feed it back to the fishers and the exporters. So this is a busy slide, but this gives you kind of the timeline. So we started the trainings in 2015, basically on the boat. So we went out in the field and we'd go to these different areas, and there'd be myself and some other veterinarians and other fish health professionals. And we would go with the trainees and we'd say, okay, this is, as a veterinarian, we're looking at this. These are the issues that we're seeing. And then we sample fish and we do the fish workups with them and train them how to do the workups. Then we did an intensive workshop in Manaus that was a week long, and it was kind of a 8 in the morning till 10 at night type of thing for them. And then they went out and started doing trainings. So they started doing trainings every year in the different parts of the Rio Negro. The only year they lost was 2020 due to COVID. And many of you may have heard about what a mess Manaus was. They were actually had to import medical oxygen into that city. So nothing happened then, but then they started right up again. And they've actually started working with exporters. So lots of work with the fishers and now working with exporters. Last year, they started doing a workshop on the management of associations and cooperatives. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but Project Piaba helped the fishers develop their own cooperative. Then they did another workshop in Daraqua. And even though they did it in these individual towns, or villages, fishers would come in from different areas to do the training. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the geographical span of where he did this. Training with exporters here in Manaus, and then we have this is Barcelos, and then Daraqua is up in this area, and then we had this is Santa Isabella and San Gabriel. So they're really spread out on this big section of river. And this just gives you an idea of how the training program, what we covered, and this is kind of sort of a typical extent train the trainer thing. So, you know, we covered kind of the basic biology and physiology and health management during the daytime, and, you know, anatomy and physiology, how that interacts with the captive environment, principles of nutrition, packing and storage, health management and biosecurity, water quality, common diseases. Then we go into sort of the lab-based things in the afternoon, microscope use, did a refresher on microscope use, fish dissection, water quality evaluation, principles of system management. Some of the systems, the export systems, had a little more advanced systems with some recirculating components. So we talked about that. The evenings basically were how to be an extension agent. You know, principles of adult education, intercultural communication. You think, why do you do that? Well, a lot of the trainers, you know, most of them they all have college degrees. Many of them are while they live in the area now, not all of them were from the area. And Amazonas, that state, is a very rural area, and the level of education is different. And there are big cultural differences between individuals with a college education and those that don't have that. So kind of how to work through that, how to serve the stakeholder, how to implement a program. And the way we set this up is that at the end of each of these sections, all of the trainers broke into groups, and the task was all this stuff we just reviewed. You need to figure out what's the most important aspect of this that needs to be relayed to the fishers, the exporters, and the transit station managers in a way that they can understand it. And so after each section, that's what they did. That's why it took so long. But by the time they got to the end, they had their curriculum. So this is just some pictures of the workshop. Lots of individuals came in. We had some Brazilian parasitologists that came in, water quality specialists. This is me lecturing. Now, I don't speak Portuguese. In fact, I get accused of mixing some Portuguese words with Japanese words, so it really gets awkward sometimes. But this is Dr. Sandra Juclard. She's a Brazilian veterinarian, actually lives on the Oregon coast. And but she has worked in these areas. She's a DVM, PhD, Master of Public Health, and she's worked in kind of these sort of extension in rural environments. So she's my translator. And what was great about that is she kind of knew the idioms and she knew the in-jokes and things like that. So I'd lecture and then she'd translate for me, and it worked out really well. Plus, she's just a great teacher herself. And then here's where they break up into the groups and take those challenges we gave them. Okay, you just talked about key points of anatomy and physiology. What's important about that the fishers need to understand when they're collecting the fish? And how are you going to relate that? And then, of course, lots of hands-on lab work. We couldn't do this without a lot of support. So a lot of these groups, all of these groups gave us support. The big funding for putting on the training program actually came from the Lisbon Aquarium and from WPA with equipment support from Segrest and Mars. INPA provided the training facility. And then here's one of our trainings. This is in Daraqua. It became a family event. Everybody got involved. And then here they're getting the first group that got their certificates. So this gentleman here, he used to be the lead trainer. This is Arnold Lugo. He's now finishing up his PhD, studying the interaction between forest fires and Amazonian fish assemblages. So he's just finishing up there. And we have a new group of lead trainers that are going out now. So what are some of our outcomes? Well, we have standard curriculum developed. The fishers love the trainings. And the exporters and the fishers are reporting after they did the course, we're seeing changes in handling practices and improved quality of the fish. We're still seeing some issues. The transit stations in kind of the middle part of the chain, we're still seeing some issues, and that's kind of what we're working on now. And next year's expedition will be focusing on that a little bit more. The other thing we're doing is we've built this app for our trainers to use when they're out in the field, so they can do health assessments, and then when they get back to Barcelos, it just gets uploaded to the cloud, and then we can start tracking things in between our trips every 2 years. Well, a couple other outcomes that weren't really part of what I do, but were kind of interesting. I already told you that Orna Pesca, that's the Fishers Cooperative, Project Piaba helped develop that. The other thing, which is a huge deal, 700 species of fish in the Middle Rio Negro now have geographical indicator status. So they are recognized as unique species, unique products coming from this part, like champagne and Stilton cheese. They have that same recognition. A couple other cool things. I guess this is Project Piaba for Ornamental Fish is the title of a short little 10-minute documentary we put together when I took a team of videographers and down. So if you're interested in seeing that, it kind of traces the fish all the way back here to Portland. And then this is a 2-part documentary on the aquarium fish trade in the Amazon. You might find interesting to watch. It's free. Don McConnell, who was the videographer who put it together, basically he had enough industry support that he was able to make this available free. So you can go on YouTube and you can watch this. It's about an hour and a half long. It's really interesting and really well done. So I will tell you that the production qualities between his and ours are dramatically different. And then finally, I just wanted to put this up. This actually just happened a week and a half ago. Our trainers basically put together another Train the Trader program. So they have trained the next generation of trainers to work with the fishers. And this was a report they sent to us. So that's this is what an extension person loves to see. So we set up this program. They are now securing their own funding. They're training their next generation of trainers, and that next generation of trainers, after they finished the training, went out and 3 days later put on their first training in a village, which is pretty cool. Some of the work with exporters, we kind of wind down. This is one exporter we've been working with since 2013, Amazon Pexi, and just working with them and talking about proper handling and proper holding. I'm just going to show you the changes in his facilities. So when we first visited there, and you saw these pictures already, these are basically just holes in the ground that are lined. So a few tanks, but these are difficult to clean and difficult to disinfect between uses. So then in 2016, he had switched to these are just little wading pools, hold the fish really well. They're all kind of recirculating systems. They all have biofilters in them, and he can add a little bit of makeup water, work really well. Still has the tanks, but that works for certain species pretty well. And then right before COVID hit, this is how the facility has changed. So he's upgraded the tanks back here, and he's added these larger tanks with woody debris in here for the fish that like to hang out in the woody debris. And a lot more tanks here. So once the fish are sorted, he can hold them here before they're packed up, but that make them a lot easier to monitor them and look at their health. So there's some pretty gratifying changes to see. And that's the end. That's the project. If anyone is interested in going on an expedition, we have I think January 21st of next year is when our next expedition leaves, if anyone's interested in going. Are there any questions? I'm sorry. There aren't any. No. So it's incumbent upon the importers to know about the risks. So there aren't any, and that's a difference between different countries. But right now there aren't really any. I mean, there are some if you're bringing in koi and goldfish now, but not really for these ornamental fish, unless they're CITES listed species, something like that. Then there's an issue, but nothing related to animal health. Any other questions?
Wait. No, you just gave me the microphone, so people talking.
Well, I know, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead while you get there. So I believe it was last year, we had a gentleman from the fish industry, and they talked about having a fish festival that's judged and all the costumes.
Yep.
Does your area?
That's a nice
participate?
segue. Can we roll the film?
Oh. This was not planned.
So the cool thing about this fishery is this gives you an idea of how culturally important this is. This is a fish festival that happens every year in Barcelos. And it's basically just to celebrate the ornamental fish or the aquarium fish industry. There are two teams. The yellow ones are the disco, people that collect this. And then the red and blue ones are the cardinals. They collect cardinal tetras, and it's a competition. Every year they have new costumes designed, new music, it's live music, and new dances. The festival starts at 9 and usually ends up at about 2 in the morning. And generally our group are the only North Americans that are there. This is all local.
Tem muitos valor e tradição. Ela adormecida, Serra da Boa Esperança.
Bring in judges from Rio and Sao Paulo, and so each team is judged, and it's a big deal to find out who wins each year.
As I recall, our very own AKC board member, Charlie Garvin, he spoke last year, volunteered to be a judge of one of these competitions.
The costumes are amazing. So that's the disco side. Each side of the stadium is one of the teams. And this stadium was built specifically for this festival. It holds about 10,000 people. So it's a thing. When it's festival time, the fort is just packed with folks.
econômica. É o ciclo que vem de perto. Sustenta a vida, alimenta o sonho. É a expressão da comida, glória, Rio Negrinho. Canto que vem das águas, presente divino ao piabeiro. Em simplesmente celebra o tesouro e reluz o recanto do gigante negro. Esse pandeiro de emoção, vou poemizar nessa canção. A força que move essa festa brilha cardinal. Estou a cantar. Surge das sombras do mundo inteiro, um brilho etéreo fundador. Estrela de quinta grandeza, conhecei a fronteira das águas, parei o universo terreno, desnuda os olhos e quem o vê, habita nas águas da terra, da via, e olha o coração, faz estremecer.
That year, it was the Cardinals. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. Cindy, we have time for a few questions. Behind you.
Thanks. The presentation was great. Just one question. With all the recommendations you made to the villages, were there any financial limitations that maybe were a barrier to adopting what you recommended?
The biggest one so far has been properly formulated food, because they're just not in a position to buy that. So right now, what we've done is they can access commercial aquaculture chow, which is really typically tilapia chow, which maybe isn't optimal, but it will work. So we've really focused on teaching them to properly store that food, because it's usually just left out open in the bag. We're working on getting more traditional aquarium fish diets to them. And there are a number of companies that are now, didn't used to be, but are now in Brazil. And we are able, it looks like we're going to be able to get them at a discounted rate for the fishers. And hopefully, once they're being produced regularly in Brazil, they can, get them, the cost can maybe be close to the aquaculture feed, but that's not really my area. But we're working on it. That's probably the biggest barrier.
Hang on.
Clearly, you have a significant impact on the economy. How many families does the fish industry support in these countries?
Right now, reasons for that, but right now about 350 families, but it used to be 1,000 families. And one of the big reasons it's dropped is because of competition. What is fortunate about that is what some of the families that are still doing it, they've diversified a little bit. So on the Rio Negro, there is a recreational fishery for peacock bass. And there are a lot of, North Americans and Europeans that like to come and fish. And so there are a couple of villages that they still fish, but they also have built small eco lodges. And so they do commercial or recreational fishing. They work as fishing guides. But the big issue is, and one of the reasons that the number of families has dropped as well is because of that competition. And then because the importers aren't interested in stabilizing the fish, spending the money to stabilize the fish. So that's one of the things we're working on, is trying to stabilize the fish. What's interesting, and you'd be surprised at this, is that oftentimes these fish are actually still cheaper than the aquacultured species. And so, and they tend to be, and this is in my experience, some other people may disagree. If you get good stabilized fish in, they tend to be they have better color. and they tend to be pretty healthy once you get them stabilized. But it's a big issue. Yeah. But there's probably never more than 1,000 or 1,500 families, but that's quite a few on that section of the Rio Negro. And the other thing about this is that we always viewed working with this fishery as more of a model, because there are a number of other fisheries like this all around the world. And so we always viewed this as not that we were saving hundreds of thousands of jobs, but it was a way to show that if these NGOs could work in a particular way with these fisheries, we might be able to preserve them. And at this point, it's not only you're trying to preserve the access to some really cool species, but also lifestyles that these people really don't want to leave. We did some studies not studies, but interviews with these individuals, many of these fishers, and they don't want to leave. They like where they live. They don't want to move to the city. And there's all these issues with these families moving to the cities, and they want to stay where they are. And so we really view it as broader than just providing more cool fish for the industry. Hopefully that answers your question.